In the ancient world, when empires rose and fell like morning mist, when the clash of bronze and iron echoed across dusty plains, there lived a people caught between their faith and their fear. The children of Israel, descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, found themselves trapped in a nightmare of oppression that seemed to have no end. This is not a story of kings or princes. This is not the tale of mighty warriors brandishing gleaming swords or commanding vast armies. This is the story of the most unexpected hero in all of Scripture, a woman whose name would echo through the corridors of time, whose single act of courage would shatter the chains of 20 years of brutal tyranny. Her name was Jael. In an age when women were expected to remain silent, she spoke with her actions. In a time when the weak were crushed beneath the wheels of war, chariots, she became the instrument of divine justice. And in one fateful moment, armed with nothing more than a tent peg and a hammer, she would change the course of history forever. But to understand the magnitude of what Jael accomplished, we must first journey back to a time of darkness when the very survival of God's chosen people hung by the thinnest of threads, when hope seemed as distant as the stars, and when the oppressor's grip tightened like a noose around the neck of a nation. The sun had set on Israel's glory days. The promises given to their fathers seemed like distant dreams, fading memories of a God who had once parted seas and toppled walls. Now, the only sound that filled their ears was the thunderous rumble of iron wheels, the crack of whips, and the harsh laughter of their enemies. For 20 long years they had endured this living hell. 20 years of watching their sons dragged away as slaves, their daughters violated their crops, seized by foreign hands. 20 years of bowing their heads in submission while their hearts burned with a mixture of rage and desperation. And yet in the darkest hour, when all seemed lost, God was preparing to reveal His power through the most unlikely vessel. A woman sitting quietly in her tent, watching, waiting, and ready to strike a blow that would reverberate through eternity. This is her story. This is the story of Jael, the woman who drove a tent peg through the head of Israel's greatest enemy and became one of the most celebrated heroes in all of biblical history. Prepare your hearts, for you are about to witness how God uses the foolish things of the world to shame the wise, how He chooses the weak to confound the mighty, and how sometimes the most unlikely person becomes the instrument of His perfect justice. The stage is set, the players are in position, and the God of Israel is about to demonstrate once again that His ways are not our ways, His thoughts are not our thoughts, and His power is made perfect in weakness. Welcome to the story of Jael, the woman who saved a nation with a single decisive blow. The morning sun cast long shadows across the hills of Canaan, but its light brought no comfort to the people huddled in their homes. For 20 years now, that same sun had risen on scenes of oppression, violence, and despair. 20 years since King Jabin of Hazor had tightened his iron grip around the throat of Israel, choking the life from God's chosen people. In the fortress city of Harosheth, General Sisera stood on his palace ramparts, surveying his domain with the cold satisfaction of a predator. Below him stretched endless rows of war chariots, 900 of them, each one a masterpiece of military engineering, each one a symbol of his absolute power. These were not the crude wooden chariots of lesser armies. These were instruments of death forged from iron, their wheels designed to crush bone, their sides bristling with scythe-like blades that could slice through infantry like wheat before the harvest. The sound of these chariots had become the soundtrack of Israel's nightmares. The rumble of 900 iron wheels rolling across the countryside meant only one thing: death was coming, and there was nowhere to run. Sisera was not merely a general, he was the embodiment of organized terror. His reputation preceded him like a plague, spreading fear from Dan to Beersheba. Children learned to recognize the sound of his approaching army before they could walk. Mothers would clutch their babies closer when they heard the distant thunder of his war machines. Old men would shake their heads and remember better days, wondering if God had truly abandoned his people. The general's strategy was as brilliant as it was brutal. He had divided the land of Israel into territories of influence, each one carefully monitored by his garrisons. No major trade route remained free from his control. No harvest could be gathered without paying tribute to his war chest. No young man could reach fighting age without being pressed into his service or eliminated as a potential threat. But it was more than military domination that crushed the spirit of Israel. Sisera understood that to truly conquer a people, you must destroy their identity, their hope, and their faith. Throughout the conquered territories, he had erected shrines to Canaanite gods, Baal, Asherah, and Molech. These were not merely religious symbols. They were psychological warfare weapons designed to make the Israelites question everything their fathers had taught them about the one true God. "Where is your Jehovah now?" Sisera's soldiers would taunt when they collected taxes from Israelite farmers. "Where is the God who supposedly parted the Red Sea? Why doesn't he save you from our chariots?" And in the deepest, most desperate corners of their hearts, many Israelites began to ask the same questions. The economic oppression was systematic and devastating. Every bushel of grain, every jar of oil, every piece of silver had to be accounted for and taxed. Sisera's tax collectors moved through the land like locusts, leaving barely enough for survival in their wake. Families that had once been prosperous found themselves reduced to begging. Communities that had thrived for generations crumbled under the weight of impossible tribute demands. But perhaps most crushing of all was the cultural and spiritual devastation. The great festivals of Israel, Passover, Pentecost, the Feast of Tabernacles, these sacred celebrations that had once united the 12 tribes in joyful worship had become dangerous gatherings that attracted unwanted attention from occupying forces. The songs of Zion fell silent. The teaching of the law became a whispered activity, passed down in secret from parent to child like contraband. In many towns and villages, the temptation to simply give up proved overwhelming. If the God of their fathers would not defend them, perhaps it was time to embrace the gods of their conquerors. Baal worship spread like wildfire through communities that had once been strongholds of faith. The sacred groves where Abraham had built altars to the Lord were now corrupted with the obscene rituals of fertility cults. Young men who should have been learning the ways of righteousness instead found themselves drawn to the power and prestige of serving in Sisera's army. Why cling to the fading promises of a God who seemed absent when you could align yourself with the obviously superior power of iron chariots and Canaanite gold? The tribal structure that had once given Israel its strength began to fracture under the pressure. Ancient rivalries between the tribes temporarily set aside during the conquest of the Promised Land under Joshua now flared back to life with dangerous intensity. Ephraim blamed Judah for bringing God's judgment upon them. Benjamin accused Manasseh of compromising with the enemy. The unity that had once made them formidable was dissolving into bitter recriminations and mutual suspicion. In this atmosphere of desperation and division, crime flourished. When people lose hope in divine justice, they often abandon human justice as well. Robbery, murder, and betrayal became commonplace. Neighbor turned against neighbor. Ancient codes of honor were abandoned in the struggle for survival. The roads that had once carried pilgrims to worship sites and merchants to markets now stood empty except for Sisera's patrols. Travel became so dangerous that trade nearly ceased entirely. The vibrant interconnected society that had emerged during the early days of settlement gave way to isolated communities living in constant fear. But it was in the realm of faith that the damage proved most profound. The generation that remembered the miraculous conquest under Joshua was dying out. Their children had grown up under the shadow of Canaanite oppression, hearing more about the power of Sisera's war chariots than about the power of the God who had once made the walls of Jericho fall. The priesthood, too, had been corrupted and compromised. Some priests had fled to remote areas where they could continue their sacred duties in secret. Others had been killed or enslaved. Still others had made their peace with the occupying forces, offering incense to foreign gods in exchange for personal safety and privilege. The sacred Ark of the Covenant, which had once led Israel's armies to victory, now sat neglected in some hidden place, its location known only to a faithful few who guarded the secret with their lives. The very symbol of God's presence with his people had become a relic of better days, a reminder of what was lost rather than a source of hope for what might yet be regained. And yet, even in this darkest hour, not all of Israel had bowed the knee to Baal. Scattered throughout the land like glowing coals, hidden beneath the ashes of a seemingly dead fire, there remained those whose faith burned bright. These were the remnant, men and women who continued to believe that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had not forgotten his covenant people. They met in secret, in caves and hidden valleys, passing down the ancient stories and keeping alive the hope that deliverance would come. They taught their children to pray in whispers, to remember the law in their hearts, even when they could not speak it aloud, to watch for the day when the God of their fathers would once again stretch out his mighty arm on behalf of his chosen people. These faithful few clung to the promises given to their ancestors, promises that seemed increasingly impossible with each passing year. They remembered the words spoken through Moses that God would scatter them among the nations if they turned away from him, but that he would also gather them back when they returned to him with all their hearts. And slowly, as the 20th year of oppression drew to its close, a change began to stir in the hearts of God's people. The allure of Canaanite gods, which had once seemed so appealing, began to lose its luster. The promises of prosperity and peace that had come with idol worship had proven to be lies. Instead of blessing, there had been only deeper bondage. Instead of peace, there had been only more violence and fear. In homes throughout Israel, mothers began to teach their children the old prayers in whispered voices. Fathers started telling the ancient stories once again, stories of a God who had delivered their people from slavery in Egypt, who had provided for them in the wilderness, who had given them victory over enemies far more powerful than themselves. The time of judgment was drawing to a close. The season of deliverance was about to dawn. And though they could not yet see it, God was already moving the pieces into position for one of the most dramatic reversals in all of biblical history. But the instrument of that deliverance would not be what anyone expected. It would not be a mighty army or a powerful king. It would not even be a male warrior in the traditional sense. Instead, God was preparing to demonstrate his power through two remarkable women, one a judge and prophetess who would call the people back to faith and courage, and another a quiet tent dweller who would strike a blow for freedom that would echo through the ages. The darkest hour was almost over. The dawn of deliverance was about to break. And in the darkness, those who had eyes to see could already make out the first faint glimmers of hope appearing on the horizon. But first, the people of Israel had to reach the absolute end of their own strength, the complete exhaustion of their own resources, the total desperation that would finally drive them to their knees in genuine repentance and cry out to the God they had almost forgotten. That moment was coming, and when it arrived, ye would be ready to answer in a way that would astonish both his people and their enemies, demonstrating once again that his power is not limited by human expectations or conventional military wisdom. The stage was set for one of the most unlikely victories in human history. In the hill country of Ephraim, beneath the spreading branches of an ancient palm tree, sat a woman unlike any other in Israel. Her name was Deborah, and in an age when women were rarely heard in public discourse, her voice had become the most trusted and respected in all the land. She was more than a judge. She was a prophetess, a living conduit between the God of Israel and his oppressed people. The palm of Deborah, as it came to be known, stood between Ramah and Bethel, positioned strategically along one of the major routes through the hill country. Here, beneath its shade, people came from across the tribes of Israel to seek justice, wisdom, and hope. They came because word had spread that this woman possessed something that had become exceedingly rare in their dark times, a direct connection to the Almighty. Deborah was not a large woman, nor did she possess the physical presence that typically commanded respect in a warrior culture. But there was something in her eyes, something in the way she carried herself that spoke of divine authority. When she spoke, even the most hardened veterans of Sisera's oppression fell silent. When she rendered judgment, both parties accepted her decisions without question, knowing they had heard not merely human wisdom, but the very voice of God. Her rise to prominence had been gradual, but unmistakable. In the early years of Jabin's oppression, when the traditional structures of Israelite leadership had crumbled, Deborah had begun to receive visions and dreams that proved remarkably accurate. She foresaw famines before they struck, predicted the movements of enemy patrols, and provided counsel that saved countless lives. But it was more than prophetic insight that set Deborah apart. She possessed an unshakable faith in the character and promises of God that served as a beacon of hope in the surrounding darkness. While others questioned whether the Lord had abandoned his people, Deborah proclaimed with unwavering certainty that their suffering was not evidence of God's absence, but of his love. The discipline of a father preparing his children for something greater. The Lord has not forgotten his covenant, she would tell the weeping mothers who brought her news of sons lost to Sisera's army. Every tear you shed is counted by the one who delivered us from Egypt. Every prayer you whisper in the darkness is heard by the God who parted the Red Sea. The time of deliverance is coming, and when it arrives, you will see that our God has been working even in our deepest pain. Her days began before dawn with prayer and meditation, seeking the Lord's guidance for the challenges that each day would bring. The stream of people seeking her counsel seemed endless. Farmers whose crops had been seized, families torn apart by conscription merchants, ruined by excessive taxation, and always the desperate question, when will God save us? Deborah's answers were never simple platitudes or empty comfort. She possessed an uncanny ability to see into the heart of each situation, to discern the spiritual realities behind the physical circumstances. To the farmer, she might speak of the need for integrity in his business dealings. To the grieving mother, she offered both comfort and challenge, reminding her that God's purposes often unfold over generations. To the merchant, she provided practical wisdom wrapped in spiritual truth. But increasingly, as the 20th year of oppression progressed, Deborah's prophetic visions began to focus on a single recurring theme. The time of judgment was ending, and the season of deliverance was at hand. She saw images of chariots bogged down in mud, of proud warriors fleeing in terror, of a great celebration echoing across the hills of Israel. And in her visions, she saw something that troubled and amazed her in equal measure. The victory would come, not through the strength of Israel's warriors, but through the faith and courage of women. She saw herself leading men into battle, something that violated every social convention of her time. More disturbing still, she saw another woman, a figure she could not yet clearly identify, striking the decisive blow that would break the power of Israel's oppression. It was during one of these prophetic experiences that God gave Deborah a specific command that would set in motion the events leading to Israel's deliverance. She was to summon Barak, the son of Abinoam, from Kadesh Naphtali, and deliver to him a divine commission that would either restore him to greatness or destroy him entirely. Barak was known throughout the northern territories as a man of considerable military skill and personal courage. In the early years of Sisera's occupation, he had led several successful guerrilla raids against isolated Canaanite outposts. His reputation as a fighter was unquestioned, but his faith in the God of Israel had been severely tested by 20 years of apparent divine silence. When the messenger arrived at his stronghold in the mountains of Naphtali, summoning him to meet with the prophetess at her palm tree, Barak's initial reaction was skepticism. He had heard of Deborah's reputation, of course, but he had learned to be cautious about prophetic claims. Too many false hopes had been raised and dashed in the long years of oppression. The journey from Kadesh to the palm of Deborah took 3 days, giving Barak ample time to consider what this summons might mean. He traveled with a small escort of his most trusted men, taking back roads and mountain paths to avoid Sisera's patrols. The very fact that he had to move like a fugitive in what should have been his own land only reinforced his bitter awareness of how completely their world had changed. When he finally stood before Deborah beneath the spreading branches of her palm tree, Barak found himself face to face with someone entirely different from what he had expected. Here was no wild-eyed mystic or manipulative charlatan. Instead, he encountered a woman of obvious intelligence and deep spiritual authority. someone who radiated the kind of inner strength that comes only from intimate communion with the divine. Deborah's first words to him were not what he had prepared himself to hear. "Barak, son of Abinoam, the Lord God of Israel, commands you, go deploy troops at Mount Tabor, and take with you 10,000 men of the sons of Naphtali and of the sons of Zebulun. I will deploy Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, with his chariots and his multitude at the river Kishon, and I will deliver him into your hand." The silence that followed was profound. Barak stared at this woman who had just delivered what could only be interpreted as a divine commission for him to lead Israel in open rebellion against their oppressors. The implications were staggering. If she was right, and if God truly intended to deliver Sisera into his hands, then the long night of oppression was about to end. But if she was wrong, or if he misunderstood the timing or the method, then he would not only destroy himself, but potentially bring even greater disaster upon his people. 10,000 men, Barak repeated slowly, against 900 iron chariots, against the most powerful military force in the region. He paused, studying Deborah's face for any sign of doubt or uncertainty. He found none. "And you believe that the Lord will deliver such an enemy into my hands?" "I do not believe it," Deborah replied with quiet certainty. "I know it. The God who brought down the walls of Jericho, who stopped the sun in its course for Joshua, who has never broken a single promise to his covenant people, this same God has spoken. Sisera's days are numbered. The question is not whether deliverance will come, but whether you will have the faith and courage to be the instrument God uses to bring it about." Barak felt something stirring within him that he had not experienced for years. Hope. Not the desperate, grasping hope of a drowning man reaching for any floating debris, but the solid, confident hope that comes from hearing the authentic voice of the Almighty. Yet, even as faith began to kindle in his heart, practical concerns crowded into his mind. 10,000 men, he said again. "Even if I could gather such a force without Sisera's spies detecting the mobilization, what makes you think they would follow me into what appears to be certain death? Our people have been beaten down for 20 years. They've learned to survive by keeping their heads down and avoiding confrontation. You're asking me to inspire them to face the most feared military commander in the region with weapons and tactics that proved inadequate 2 decades ago." It was then that Deborah spoke words that revealed both the depth of her prophetic insight and the boldness of her faith. "The victory will not be won by conventional weapons or traditional tactics. The Lord will fight for Israel in a way that will leave no doubt about the source of our deliverance. You will gather your men and you will position them at Mount Tabor as God has commanded. But know this, Barak, because you have hesitated, because you require additional assurance beyond the word of the Lord, the honor of killing Sisera will not be yours. The Lord will sell Sisera into the hand of a woman." The prophecy hit Barak like a physical blow. In his warrior culture, the greatest honor a man could achieve was to defeat his people's enemies in single combat. To be told that he would lead the army to victory, but that another would claim the ultimate prize was both encouraging and humbling. But it was the specific detail that troubled him most. A woman would kill Sisera. In a world where warfare was the exclusive domain of men, this seemed almost impossible to believe. "What woman?" Barak asked. "Do you speak of yourself?" Deborah smiled, but there was something mysterious in her expression. "I will indeed go with you into battle, for the Lord has shown me that my presence will be necessary for the victory to unfold as He intends. But I am not the woman who will strike down Sisera. That honor belongs to another, though her identity remains hidden from me. I see only that she is not a warrior, not a woman of obvious power or position. She is in the eyes of the world unremarkable, yet in the purposes of God, she will become the instrument of justice." The conversation that followed lasted deep into the night. Deborah shared with Barak the visions she had received, the specific details of how the battle would unfold, and the role that divine intervention would play in their victory. She spoke of chariots rendered useless by terrain and weather of enemy forces, thrown into confusion and panic, of a rout so complete that it would break forever the myth of Canaanite military superiority. But more than tactical details, Deborah provided Barak with something he had almost forgotten how to possess: absolute confidence in the power and faithfulness of God. She reminded him of the great victories of the past, not as ancient history, but as precedents for what God was prepared to do again. She spoke of the crossing of the Red Sea, the conquest under Joshua, the miraculous deliverances in the time of the previous judges, weaving these stories into a tapestry of divine faithfulness that stretched from the call of Abraham to the present moment. "Our God does not change," she told him as the first light of dawn began to filter through the palm branches above them. "He is the same yesterday, today, and forever. What He did for Moses, He will do for us. What He accomplished through Joshua, He will accomplish through you. The God who chose David to face Goliath has chosen Barak to face Sisera. The question is not whether God is able to deliver us. The question is whether you are willing to trust Him completely, even when His methods seem foolish to human wisdom." When Barak finally departed from the palm of Deborah, he carried with him more than a military commission. He carried a renewed sense of calling, a restored confidence in divine purpose, and a clear understanding of what God required of him. The doubts and hesitations that had plagued him for 20 years had not entirely disappeared, but they had been overwhelmed by something far stronger: the certainty that the God of Israel was about to act in power. The task before him was daunting. He had to return to the northern territories and somehow convince 10,000 men to join what would appear to any rational observer as a suicide mission. He had to mobilize this force without attracting the attention of Sisera's intelligence network. He had to maintain their morale and unity during what might be weeks of preparation and waiting. And he had to do all of this while trusting that a woman, a prophetess whose authority came from God alone, would somehow provide the key to victory. But as Barak made his way back toward Kadesh, traveling once again by hidden paths and mountain routes, he found himself thinking less about the challenges ahead and more about the remarkable woman he had just encountered. Deborah represented something that had been missing from Israel for far too long: authentic spiritual authority combined with practical wisdom and unshakable courage. In a time when most of their leaders had either compromised with the enemy or fled into hiding, here was someone who stood firm in the gap, pointing the way back to faith and freedom. If God could raise up such a leader in the person of a woman, then perhaps the impossible victory she promised was not so impossible after all. The word began to spread quietly through the network of faithful Israelites who had maintained their hope through 2 decades of oppression. The prophetess had spoken. The time of deliverance was at hand, and the man chosen to lead them back to freedom was already beginning to gather his forces for the battle that would change everything. But even as preparations began for the military campaign that would free Israel from Canaanite oppression, the most crucial player in the drama had not yet taken the stage. Somewhere in the territories controlled by Sisera's forces, a woman was going about her daily routine completely unaware that she was about to become one of the most celebrated heroes in all of biblical history. Her name was Jael, and her moment of destiny was rapidly approaching. The gathering storm of rebellion began as whispers in marketplaces and quiet conversations in olive groves. But within weeks, it had grown into something that could no longer be hidden from Sisera's extensive network of spies and informants. Throughout the northern territories of Israel, men were quietly slipping away from their homes and fields, making their way by hidden paths toward Mount Tabor, where Barak was assembling the army of liberation. They came not as seasoned warriors marching in formation, but as farmers and shepherds, craftsmen and merchants, young men barely out of adolescence and grizzled veterans who remembered the early days of the occupation. What united them was not military experience or sophisticated equipment, but something far more powerful, a desperate hope that the God of their fathers was finally ready to act on their behalf. Mount Tabor rose majestically from the plain, its distinctive dome shape visible from miles away. It was here, according to Deborah's prophetic instructions, that the forces of liberation would gather. The mountain's strategic significance was obvious to anyone with military knowledge. From its heights, an army could observe the movements of enemy forces across the entire Jezreel Valley while remaining relatively secure from surprise attack. Barak established his command post near the summit, where ancient Canaanite ruins provided some shelter and defensive positions. As he watched his army grow day by day, he found himself marveling at the diversity of men who had answered the call. The tribes of Naphtali and Zebulun, as Deborah had specified, formed the core of his forces. But volunteers had come from across Israel, even from the distant territories of Judah and Benjamin. Small groups of fighters had made the dangerous journey north to join the cause. The weapons they brought were a stark reminder of how thoroughly Sisera had suppressed Israelite military capabilities. Most carried farming implements hastily converted to weapons: scythes, pruning hooks, ox goads sharpened to deadly points. A few possessed actual swords or spears carefully hidden for 20 years against the hope that someday they might again be needed. But iron weapons, the technological advantage that made Sisera's forces so formidable, were almost entirely absent from their arsenal. What they lacked in equipment, however, they began to make up for in morale and determination. As word spread of Deborah's prophecy and Barak's commission, something that had been dormant in the Israelite spirit began to awaken. Men who had spent 2 decades bowing their heads in submission began to remember what it felt like to stand straight. Voices that had been reduced to whispers in the presence of Canaanite authorities began to rise in songs of ancient faith. The transformation was most visible in the evening gatherings around the campfires scattered across the mountain slopes. Where once these men might have spoken only of their fear and desperation, they now shared stories of God's faithfulness in the past. They recounted the miracles of the Exodus, the victories of Joshua, the great deeds of previous judges. They spoke of their hope for their children, their vision of a land free from foreign domination, their dream of once again worshiping the Lord without fear. Barak moved among these gatherings nightly, listening to his men sharing his own faith, and gradually building the bonds of trust and confidence that would be essential when the time for battle arrived. He spoke to them not as a distant commander, but as a fellow Israelite who had endured the same oppression, harbored the same doubts, and now shared the same hope for deliverance. But even as the army grew stronger in spirit, Barak wrestled with the practical challenges of his situation. Intelligence reports from his scouts painted a sobering picture of what they would face when Sisera chose to respond to their challenge. The Canaanite commander had apparently been monitoring the mobilization on Mount Tabor, but rather than moving immediately to crush the rebellion, he seemed to be gathering his own forces for a decisive confrontation. This delay was both a blessing and a curse. It gave Barak more time to train his inexperienced fighters and strengthen their resolve, but it also meant that when Sisera finally moved, he would do so with overwhelming force. The latest report suggested that the Canaanite army would include not only the feared 900 iron chariots, but also infantry units drawn from across the region and allied forces from neighboring kingdoms who saw the Israelite rebellion as a threat to their own security. It was during this period of preparation and waiting that Deborah arrived at Mount Tabor, accompanied by a small escort of her most trusted followers. Her presence had an immediate and powerful effect on the assembled army. Many of the men had heard of the famous prophetess, but few had actually seen her. When she moved among their camp speaking words of encouragement and sharing her prophetic insights, even the most skeptical began to believe that they were part of something truly significant. Deborah established her own position on the mountain not far from Barak's command post, where she could observe the deployment of forces and continued to receive whatever guidance the Lord might provide. Her daily routine included not only consultations with Barak about tactical matters, but also prayer sessions that often lasted for hours, seeking divine direction for the coming battle. It was during one of these extended prayer sessions that Deborah received the final piece of prophetic instruction that would determine the timing of their attack. She saw in a vision the exact moment when God would deliver Sisera into their hands, not when the Israelite army was at maximum strength, but when the forces of nature themselves would conspire to neutralize the Canaanite advantage in chariots and heavy weapons. "The rain," she told Barak when she emerged from her prophetic trance. "The Lord will send rain such as has not been seen in years. The Kishon River will swell beyond its banks, and the ground will become too soft for chariots to maneuver effectively. When you see the clouds gathering over the sea, when you feel the first drops beginning to fall, that will be the signal to attack." The wisdom of this strategy became immediately apparent to Barak. Sisera's entire military doctrine depended on the mobility and shock power of his chariot forces. If these could be neutralized by terrain conditions, the battle would become a contest between infantry forces where numbers and motivation might prove more important than superior weapons and training. But the waiting period that followed tested everyone's faith to the limit. Days passed with no sign of rain, while reports continued to arrive of Sisera's growing army massing in the valley below. The temptation to act prematurely or conversely, to lose heart and disperse, grew stronger with each passing hour. It was Deborah who held the army together during this crucial period, moving constantly among the troops, sharing her confidence that God's timing would prove perfect, reminding them that the very delay was evidence of divine providence at work. She spoke of how the Lord had often tested the faith of his people by requiring them to wait for his perfect timing, how the greatest victories in Israel's history had come not when human planning reached its peak, but when divine intervention made human weakness irrelevant. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity of waiting, the signs began to appear. Clouds gathered over the Mediterranean Sea, growing darker and more ominous by the hour. The wind shifted, bringing the smell of rain and the electric tension that precedes a major storm. And far below in the valley, Sisera's scouts reported unusual activity as the Canaanite commander began moving his massive army toward the river Kishon, apparently deciding that the time had come to crush the Israelite rebellion once and for all. When the first raindrops began to fall on Mount Tabor, Deborah and Barak stood together at the highest point of their position, watching the dramatic transformation taking place in the valley below. What had been firm, dry ground suitable for chariot warfare was rapidly becoming a muddy quagmire that would trap heavy vehicles and exhaust the horses that pulled them. "Now," Deborah said, simply, but her voice carried the authority of divine command. "The Lord has delivered Sisera into your hand. Has not the Lord gone out before you?" The battle cry that rose from 10,000 throats echoed across the valley with such power that it seemed to shake the very foundations of the mountain. "The sword of the Lord and of Barak," they shouted, invoking both divine authority and human leadership as they began their descent toward the plain where their destiny awaited. What followed was less a conventional battle than a rout of unprecedented proportions. Sisera's chariot, forces the pride of his army and the source of his 20-year dominance, found themselves helplessly bogged down in mud that grew deeper by the minute as the rain continued to fall. Horses that had once struck terror into the hearts of Israelite farmers now struggled simply to move forward, their iron chariots becoming death traps rather than instruments of war. The Canaanite infantry, trained to fight in coordination with chariot support, found themselves exposed and vulnerable when their mobile units became immobilized. The psychological impact of seeing in the ancient world when empires rose and fell like morning mist, when the clash of bronze and iron echoed across dusty plains, there lived a people caught between their faith and their fear. The children of Israel, descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, found themselves trapped in a nightmare of oppression that seemed to have no end. This is not a story of kings or princes. This is not the tale of mighty warriors brandishing gleaming swords or commanding vast armies. This is the story of the most unexpected hero in all of Scripture, a woman whose name would echo through the corridors of time, whose single act of courage would shatter the chains of 20 years of brutal tyranny. Her name was Jael. In an age when women were expected to remain silent, she spoke with her actions. In a time when the weak were crushed beneath the wheels of war chariots, she became the instrument of divine justice. And in one fateful moment, armed with nothing more than a tent peg and a hammer, she would change the course of history forever. But to understand the magnitude of what Jael accomplished, we must first journey back to a time of darkness, when the very survival of God's chosen people hung by the thinnest of threads, when hope seemed as distant as the stars, and when the oppressor's grip tightened like a noose around the neck of a nation. The sun had set on Israel's glory days. The promises given to their fathers seemed like distant dreams, fading memories of a God who had once parted seas and toppled walls. Now the only sound that filled their ears was the thunderous rumble of iron wheels, the crack of whips, and the harsh laughter of their enemies. For 20 long years they had endured this living hell. 20 years of watching their sons dragged away as slaves, their daughters violated their crops, seized by foreign hands. 20 years of bowing their heads in submission while their hearts burned with a mixture of rage and desperation. And yet in the darkest hour when all seemed lost, God was preparing to reveal His power through the most unlikely vessel, a woman sitting quietly in her tent, watching, waiting, and ready to strike a blow that would reverberate through eternity. This is her story. This is the story of Jael, the woman who drove a tent peg through the head of Israel's greatest enemy and became one of the most celebrated heroes in all of biblical history. Prepare your hearts, for you are about to witness how God uses the foolish things of the world to shame the wise, how He chooses the weak to confound the mighty, and how sometimes the most unlikely person becomes the instrument of His perfect justice. The stage is set. The players are in position. And the God of Israel is about to demonstrate once again that His ways are not our ways. His thoughts are not our thoughts. And His power is made perfect in weakness. Welcome to the story of Jael, the woman who saved a nation with a single decisive blow. The morning sun cast long shadows across the hills of Canaan, but its light brought no comfort to the people huddled in their homes. For 20 years now, that same sun had risen on scenes of oppression, violence, and despair. 20 years since King Jabin of Hazor had tightened his iron grip around the throat of Israel, choking the life from God's chosen people. In the fortress city of Harosheth, General Sisera stood on his palace ramparts, surveying his domain with the cold satisfaction of a predator. Below him stretched endless rows of war chariots, 900 of them, each one a masterpiece of military engineering, each one a symbol of his absolute power. These were not the crude wooden chariots of lesser armies. These were instruments of death, forged from iron, their wheels designed to crush bone, their sides bristling with scythe-like blades that could slice through infantry like wheat before the